Because the Bible recognizes the legitimacy of nations with borders. In that sense, I'm a nationalist.
Again, people are arguing that this idea is something that is new, something that is made up, something that we're forcing, for example, on America and on America's history. But you can only believe that if you're ignorant of who came here and established America and why.
Why, Voddie? Are you a Christian nationalist?
It depends.
Okay.
Like I said, it depends on who's asking, why they're asking, and what their definition is. And usually, most times, if somebody's asking the question like that, almost always, when I find out what their definition is and why they're asking, almost always it ends up being a no. Because if somebody comes up and they go, "Are you a Christian nationalist?" they're usually talking about that wide-eyed, wrap the Bible in the cross and the flag, you know what I mean? That caricature that almost nobody is, you know? So what I found is when people are asking the question that way, and you press back, you know, what do you mean? How are you defining it? The answer is almost always a no. But when people are, you know, like when you're reading, you know, Taking America Back for God, and you look at the list of questions, you know, I finish that and I go, well, yeah. Yes, of course I am, you know.
Sign me up at the State Department. I'm a new ambassador.
You know,
for Christian nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Theonomy, I mean, theonomy is another one of these things. I cut my teeth on the Rushdoony theonomy, the Bonson theonomy in the 70s and 80s. You know, I mean, I cut my teeth on. That's what I tried to learn. That's where I was first introduced to it and benefited from some and saw some real hesitations about it. Today, there's what is being called general equity theonomy. And to me, those seem like two different things.
Yeah.
You know? The confession talks about the civil laws no longer being binding on us. You know, they're obsolete, except for insofar as the general equity in them can be seen and applied. Well, yeah. I mean, we ought to recover that. I think that's what's happening. And the people who are recovering it, some of them saying, well, that's theonomy. And we're general equity theonomists. Well, where I come from, you can believe in general equity or you can believe in theonomy, but you can't do them both. And so that's confusing to me. I want to let people define their own terms, but it's just odd to me from my background.
What's going on, everybody? I'm Jay, the Reformed Puerto Rican dude. Thank you so much for watching this video. So, guys, listen, I want to let you know that you may hear screaming, crying, or shrieking in the background. No, I don't own a torture chamber, but I do have 4 small children. Normally, I record at night when they're in bed, but I haven't been able to, so now I'm trying to record while they're awake. So I apologize for any and all background noises. All right, so let's get right into it. So a couple of weeks ago, Founders Ministries released a couple of videos that were done as part of a conference by the Institute of Public Theology, which is Founders' kind of seminary. And I'm not trying to mock. You know, it's actually it's a very good institute, but I just call it a kind of seminary because they don't consider themselves a seminary. I don't think they're accredited or anything like that, so I think that's part of the reason why they do that. But it is a very good institute, okay? And they have lots of respected theologians, reform guys, that kind of thing, who are part of the faculty. So they released 3 videos, one by Tom Ascol, the second one by Voddie Baucham, and the third it's like a panel, it's like a Q&A. And I'll post the links to each of the videos in the description below, so you can check them out. They're very interesting. I recommend that you check them out. I showed you probably saw the clips already. Well, you should have seen the clips already before this video began. But, excuse me. Yeah, you should watch the whole of the 3 videos if you have a chance to. So Tom Ascol starts by using definitions of what Christian nationalism is, or at least how it's defined by different people, right? Which honestly, they sound horrible. That they include racism, that they include America being like God's chosen nation, all sorts of ridiculous and honestly evil things, which of course, Tom Ascol denounces these things, and he agrees that if Christian nationalism is defined by these things, then for sure he is not a Christian nationalist, and Christians shouldn't be involved in Christian nationalism if indeed these definitions are correct. All right, so then Dr. Ascol offers Paul Miller's definition, and he agrees that under this definition, he would be comfortable saying that he is a Christian nationalist. So the definition goes as follows. Let me make sure I got it here. Okay, so this is how it goes. It says, Christian nationalism asserts that there is something identifiable as an American nation, distinct from other nations, that American nationhood is and should remain defined by Christianity and Christian cultural norms, and that the American people and their government should actively work to defend, sustain, and cultivate America's Christian culture, heritage, and values. Okay, so, yeah, Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham basically say, well, if this is the definition of Christian nationalism, okay, maybe, we can work with this. I will say this, they do kind of hesitate, and I'll probably get into that a little bit further down the video. It just seems like they don't really want to embrace the term, but they're like not completely closed off to it either. Right. Basically, they're arguing that that if Christian nationalism means that you understand that this nation, from its conception, was influenced and driven by Christian values and principles, and our goal as a Christian nation is to keep values such as the abolition of what do you call it? Killing children in the womb, right? Like the abolition of abortion. Marriage between a man and a woman being defined as a man and a woman only, right? Those kinds of things. Then, yeah, they could embrace the term Christian nationalist. But they are not trying to embrace the title as a whole, and this is what I was kind of saying, right? Like they point a lot back to the historical aspects, of Christian nationalism with regards to like the Puritans, how they wrote about that. They talk about how Romans 13 is about governments when they are doing good and not when they're doing bad, right? A lot of people take Romans 13 and say, well, we just submit to the governing authorities all the time, doesn't matter. And they're like saying, well, no, it says that when these authorities do good, that's what Romans 13 is operating under, right? Like the government does good, right? Does justice, right? It punishes evildoers. It rewards non-evildoers, that kind of thing. So if that's what we're going off of, then yeah, Romans 13 pretty much points to an argument, at least, can be made for Christian nationalism. So again, they're not trying to embrace the title as a whole. They're just saying a case could be made for Christian nationalism. All right. They also address things like the three uses of the law, which is a Reformed doctrine on what the purpose of the law of God is, right? And basically, if you don't know what the three uses of the law is, it's this. Okay. The first use of the law is like a mirror. Okay, the second use of the law is like a shield, and the third use of the law is like a compass. So basically what this means is that the first use of the law, again, mirror, shows you how sinful you are, shows you that you cannot keep the law. Okay, the second use of the law is a shield. It protects people from the evil doing of other people, essentially, right? So like, if I get angry at my neighbor, because he said something mean to me, I guess, or something like that, and I want to do something like hurt him, right? Well, the second use of the law would prevent me from doing so because I don't want to face the consequences of breaking that law, Wait, hang on 1 second, because there's something bothering me here, and it's not letting me see myself very well. And I like to make sure that I don't look like an idiot when, when I'm recording things. So anyway, so that's the second use of the law. And then the third use of the law is like a compass. It's for those people who have accepted Christ, who follow God, who love God, right? It tells us how to obey him. It tells us how to follow him, that kind of thing, right? Like if you love God, you'll keep his commandments. And so you want to make sure that you are worshiping, appropriately, right? So that's the third use of the law. All right. So specifically, the second use of the law is to restrain evil, like I said, to protect people from sin. So in a lot of Reformed circles, there's a doctrine that states that there are three spheres of authority, all of which are ultimately under the authority of God, right? So they are authorities, but they are under the authority of God. And they are the family, that's one sphere, the church, second sphere, and the government, third sphere. So while they might have overlapping roles, the government deals a lot with the second use of the law because government is supposed to be a minister of justice, right? So the government, its job is to punish evildoers, right? Part of government's job is to make sure that people are safe and that other people who are doing wrong things are face the consequences, right? Face justice. And so how can government determine what is an evildoer? And this is where we start getting into Christian nationalism, okay? It can either define it according to man's subjective standards or according to God's objective standards. And so a Christian who is a nationalist would say, well, we should be, number one, a Christian nation, if we're not already. But if we are, great. If we're not, let's be a Christian nation. And we should apply Christian principles to our laws, to our mandates, let me give you an example. A Christian nation might say, well, it's a federal holiday for Christmas, but not necessarily for Ramadan. Well, actually, not necessarily. It wouldn't be a federal national holiday to observe Ramadan, right? Like, it's just something that we as a Christian nation don't acknowledge. Now, you can, right? If you're a Muslim, if you want to go ahead and take the day off or whatever, go for it. I've talked about this in the past, so you've probably seen me use this example in another video. But you get what I'm saying. Like that's what a Christian nation would say. Okay. So in that regard, Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham are saying, yeah, we're behind this 100%. Governments should be basing their standards on God's standards. Where it gets funny with theonomy is the fact that theonomy wants to take all of God's law in both the New and the Old Testament and apply it to government. So let's actually go ahead and talk about theonomy. Okay, so in its simplest terms, and this is my personal definition of theonomy, theonomy is the idea that all of God's law, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is applicable to all people. Excuse me. So before you kill me, let me explain. I know a lot of people are like, wait a minute. So you're saying that the Old Testament laws apply to all of us? Bear with me. So the word theonomy comes from theo, meaning God, and nomos, meaning law. In other words, theonomy simply means God's law. So the issue that Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham seem to be having with theonomy is that they know it under a certain definition, right? And it's not necessarily 100% the definition that I just used. So the thing is that in the 1970s and the 80s and things like that, theonomy was brought to the discussion table by several theologians who, although I don't agree with them on everything, I do respect them. And, Tom Ascol does mention some of them, Greg Bahnsen, Rush Dooney, those kinds of guys, right? So basically during this time, they're making the case that the judicial laws in the Old Testament, right, like the government laws of Old Testament Israel, must be applied by governments as well as their consequences, right? So, if a guy steals something, I mean, I don't know, stone him to death, I guess. I got to brush up on Old Testament laws. Actually, a good example would be like, if you committed manslaughter, like if you killed somebody that you didn't mean to, there were 7 cities, I believe, of refuge where you could stay in that city and you'd be fine and nobody can touch you, right? Because you are in the city of refuge. So people like classical theonomists would say, well, yeah, we should have cities of protection for people who commit manslaughter. Okay. Now what you have, like in more modern respects, you have something called equal equity theonomy, where essentially you recognize that the judicial laws of Old Testament Israel were specific to that state, right, to that nation state, Israel. But you recognize also that the principles, right, the moral reasoning behind them, or their general equity, still apply today and should be applied. Why? Well, because think about this. What do you base any law on? Right? And this is where it overlaps with Christian nationalism. Okay? But I'm going to make the distinction, in just a moment. It is either man's subjective moral laws and standards or God's objective moral laws and standards. And you might say, well, okay, we were talking about Christian nationalism earlier. That kind of sounds like the same thing. No. Let me explain. All right, so I would consider myself an equal equity theonomist. And so the difference is that Christian nationalism wouldn't necessarily say, okay, we need to look at Old Testament laws and apply their equal equity to us today. Now, they would say, well, we should build laws on Christian principles, which is not bad, right? And that we should emphasize a Christian culture, right? Emphasize a Christian standards, not just in law, but in general, right? Like we should defend and accommodate Christian culture above everything else. There's overlap, but theonomy specifically deals with God's law specifically, right? Christian nationalism deals with an aspect of that, but not necessarily all of it. And so when being an equal equity theonomist, you still are dealing with God's law, including the Old Testament judicial system, but not applied in the exact same way, whereas classical theonomists would say, yeah, you apply it in the exact same way. I would consider myself, I don't know if I already said this. Did I already say that I would consider myself an equal equity theonomist? Well, if you didn't know, there you go. I would consider myself an equal equity theonomist. But it seems that Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham reject theonomy based on the classical definition of theonomy, right? They don't believe that equal equity theonomy is the same thing as theonomy in the classical sense, right? Like they would say equal equity theonomy is not theonomy. And here's where you get into a bit of semantics. So I get that we might be talking past each other to some extent, but I can't agree with them. The thing is that, remember, theonomy means theo, God, and nomos, law. So do I believe that all government laws should be based on God's law? Well, yes, I do. Therefore, in that sense, I'm very much a theonomist, right? And I'm including all of God's law, right? Because Christian nationalists may not be necessarily theonomists. They may say, well, we're going to base it on God's law, but we don't need to look at the judicial law. I would say, yeah, we need to look at we need to look at everything, including the judicial law. I'm not saying apply it in the exact same way, but we need to look at it. We need to consider it, and we need to extract from it the moral principle, right? The reason for that law. And again, it wouldn't apply in the exact same way. Doug Wilson talks about, how in the Old Testament people hung out in their roofs, right? Like they had little stairs that would lead them to the roof, and they would hang out up there. And so you had to have netting around your house. Well, of course that doesn't apply to us, but what does it say about what we need to do? Well, we need to take care of people when they're in our home, right? Like we're responsible for their well-being. So we do laws according to that standard. All right. So, let's see. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anything, guys. I do take notes because I tend to go off on tangents, and I don't want to do that all the time. I want to like make my point and stick to it. So, yeah, I would disagree with Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham in saying that general equity theonomy is not the same thing as theonomy. But again, semantics. So my overall thoughts. Well, Tom Ascol and Voddie Baucham, I mean, they pretty much embraced Christian nationalism the way that I see it. I think it's good that we should preserve and protect Christian values, right? That we should acknowledge the fact that we are a Christian nation. And even if we weren't, we should be, right? Like we should be a Christian nation. Because again, it kind of ties back to God's law. There's that overlap. I didn't love the fact that they are a bit apprehensive at embracing the term. I get why they are, right? Like there's negativity associated with being called a Christian nationalist, and so maybe they don't want that, they don't want to necessarily like embrace the term. They don't want to say, yeah, I'm a Christian nationalist. They're more like, okay, yeah, I mean, depending on how you define it, sure, I guess, but I don't really want the title per se. But, I mean, even though they don't necessarily want the title, I listen, part of the reason why I embrace the title is because, like, I don't think that we should be afraid anymore. Like, we have been, as Christians, we have been for too long trying to kind of appease those who are not Christian, right? Like, we've been trying to, like, okay, well, let's just all get along. There's a bit of neutrality here. We can find common ground. I'm not a Christian nationalist. We're all friends here. I'm like, you know what? No. It doesn't matter what I do. Doesn't matter what we do. They won't like us. They won't like us because at the end of the day, our message is a message that they're going to be opposed to, right? Because they hate God. They hate God. There is no neutrality. There's no neutrality, like they hate God. And so, no matter what we do, they're not going to like us. So might as well embrace it. We might as well embrace it and be like, yeah, I am a Christian nationalist. So what? What are you going to do about it? Now, I'm not saying like, fight them. I'm not saying to cause problems like, we're supposed to give a defense for the hope that is in us, but with gentleness and respect, right? So I'm not saying like just be defiant and aggressive and none of that. I'm not saying that, but it's kind of like there's a balance. You can't just be all meek and mild and soft either. Like Jesus wasn't like that. Jesus was manly. And by the way, I recommend Dale Partridge's The Manliness of Christ. Is a very short book, very nice. Just saying, side note, check it out. Because this whole like Jesus was just, he loved everyone and he was so soft, and that's nonsense. That's not what Jesus was. Jesus was whipping people and hurting people when it was necessary. He was insulting the Pharisees when it was necessary. Like he was feisty, like he is. Remember, he's a conquering king. He's not just some meek and gentle, like again, balance. Yes, he is the lamb, but he's also the lion. And so we need to find that balance as Christians. And I believe that part of it is by saying, you know what? We're not afraid of the terminology Christian nationalist. I am a Christian nationalist. So what? So I don't love that they didn't want to embrace it. But again, that's the minor thing. And they are, in my opinion, Christian nationalists, even if they don't want to necessarily 100% embrace the term. I think they're kind of like, yes, but no, but yes. I don't know. They're not here, so they can't defend themselves. It's just my takeaway. Check out the videos that they posted. I'm telling you, it'll be a huge benefit. And again, I love what they're saying. I agree with like 90 to 95% of what they say. There's like that 5 to 10% where like theonomy and some other things. But anyway, but I agree with them. So very good videos. Anyway, guys, there you go. Thank you very much for watching this video. Okay. If you have any thoughts, just let me know in the comments. I actually read the comments. Sometimes I get into arguments. I probably shouldn't do that so much. But I do want to get your thoughts. I want to see what you guys think. So go ahead and let me know what you think in the comments. If you find this channel helpful, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me at reformed.recon.channel@gmail.com. Thank you for watching, guys. Until next time, God bless.